The heads of every major settlement in the burgeoning California Republic were assembled in Farmbridge, along with the Iron Lady herself. The wolf was inside the chicken coop, only these chickens had become incredibly well-armed over the last few months. I watched her closely as the most important Congress of this new young government was called to session. In turn, she eyeballed each representative just as closely, scrutinizing every detail about them and the people they represented. She was taking stock, making mental calculations about each representative, and plotting, always plotting. The old military intelligence veteran's mind was always at work, and I had a good idea of the conclusion she was coming up with. Yes, she could take this small republic with her forces, but the cost would be dear. Not to mention she currently had bigger problems to worry about, or she wouldn't be here with nothing but a small security escort. She'd be here with an army. Ruslana had become the de facto leader of this small government, though only symbolically. Technically, there was no leader. Everything was put to a vote, but many of the representatives looked to her for guidance. I wonder if during her time on the battlefields of Ukraine, she'd ever imagined she'd end up leading a group of American nuclear survivors in sunny SoCal, of all people, of all places. Well, SoCal wasn't quite as sunny after global nuclear war, but we fared much better than most places from what rumors reached us. Turning to the Iron Lady, she nodded grimly, inviting her to rise and speak. I felt Alexis tighten her grip on my hand as we sat watching the assemblage, her feelings toward the Iron Lady clearly written on her face and mirrored by Ruslana. As the Iron Lady approached, there was the briefest of pauses as both took the other in, predators sizing each other up. These two hardened war veterans were the most powerful figures for thousands of miles, maybe the most powerful left in the United States, and neither would give the other so much as an inch if they could help it. But desperate times make for strange bedfellows. Eben the Iron Lady addressed the not-too-friendly crowd. I won't waste time on pleasantries that all of us know won't be well received. So let me get straight to the point. A great enemy gathers to the east. We've been fighting them for many months now and we're losing. We need your help. And if you don't help us, then they'll come for you once we're gone. There was an immediate explosion of reaction. Somebody shouted, "Let them break themselves on you, and we'll mop up the rest when they come for us." The outburst got a bit of an applause and a lot of murmurs of agreement. The Iron Lady didn't flinch, instead immediately took several steps toward the speaker, unnerving him and causing him to stumble backwards. Yes, they'll wipe us out, break themselves like you said, but they'll simply call for reinforcements, and while they wait, they'll rebuild off our survivors, the men, women, and children they enslave, turn them into mindless fighting abominations. But you don't have to take it from me. Eben spun on her heel to stare directly at me. Tell them. I was stunned. Did she know? Impossible. The only person who knew about my exposure to the fuego and the inevitable effects were Vaquero, and he was dead. Tell them what you saw south of the border. I was relieved. She didn't know. I cleared my throat and stood. She's right. There's thousands of them. Just 100 miles south of here. More past that. They expand like locusts, tearing settlements apart and indoctrinating anyone they don't kill, eat, or worse. There was an explosion of conversations once again. I caught sight of Clay. He was seated with his people. You could tell them apart by the crisp military fatigues they wore everywhere and the sidearms that never left their side. He returned my look, a somber look on his face. If any of us are going to survive, we need to work together, period. The Iron Lady didn't bother with an epilogue. She simply spun on her heel and walked out of the meeting hall, leaving a frenzy of conversation behind. Days 804 to 807. I testified my experiences south of the border at least a dozen times. It sounded outlandish, but if it wasn't for Clay and Annie's corroboration, I doubt anyone would have believed our story. But I was getting frustrated. While they debated what to do about the Azteco threat, the enemy only grew stronger. Eben was right, we needed to join forces. The question was, what happened after that? I wasn't foolish enough to believe the Iron Lady's ambitions to take SoCal for herself had disappeared. As the representatives debated and argued amongst themselves, I got to spend time with the family. Robbie and his sister had helped build a makeshift soccer field, and one of the workshops even fashioned regulation-sized goals out of scrap metal. It was the apocalypse, every major city on Earth burnt to ash, but under the perpetual gray clouds of nuclear winter and surrounded by Alexis, Lucky, Annie, Lilith, Robbie, and Meg, things felt okay. I thought back to that little cul-de-sac Lilith had shown me from the photograph in Big Bear. One house for each of us, so we could each live near each other like that strange little family we'd become since the world ended. We could go there. Once the Azteco threat was eliminated and the Iron Lady was sorted out, it was a nice thought. But then I remembered the fuego burning in my brain. It eventually consumed me. Vaquero had warned me. Just a matter of time. Days 808 to 812. Ruslana held a private meeting with the representatives from the most powerful settlements. Each settlement got to vote. but the number of votes they could cast was dependent on their population size. I foresaw problems with this system in the future, but for now it worked. I'd spent months with the Iron Lady, months south of the border with the Aztecos. They asked me just one question: could the Republic stand alone against this threat? No, I told them. The Iron Lady was right. We needed each other. Each member nodded in solemn agreement. That night the votes were cast. The California Republic would go to war alongside the forces of the Army of the Dawn. Days 813 to 816. Messengers were dispatched. Preparations had to be made. The Republic's first call to war would take time to organize. Logistics had to be organized. But the firepower it would bring to bear was considerable given our size. Over 1,000 fighting men and women. Many were already trained. All would undergo a 4-month training program before marching east. The Iron Lady was unhappy about this, but Ruslana refused to budge. She wouldn't send her people to pointless slaughter. The Army of the Dawn would just have to buy time with blood. I suspected this wasn't just about preparing our forces, though. I think Ruslana was literally bleeding the army so as to weaken them. I'm confident that the Iron Lady suspected the same. Reluctantly, she agreed. But there was one problem. We're running dangerously low on ammunition for the Strikers and Bradleys we've managed to recover. They're absolutely the only thing holding the line for now. We won't have enough for 4 months of fighting. We need resupply, now. All eyes turned to Clay and Johnson, the senior commander of his encampment. The old Special Forces vet shook his head immediately. We got nothing to spare. U.S. Army rounded up most of the hardware before the bombs fell. God knows where it's all at now. We got a few Strikers ourselves, some up-armored Humvees with 50 cals and Mark 19s, but not nearly enough ammo to spare. We barely have enough for one large engagement ourselves, less if the enemy also has vehicles. Then you'd better give us what you got if you expect us to hold for 4 months. And leave ourselves defenseless? That's an absolute negative, ma'am. The two were probably close in age. I wonder if they might have worked together in the past without knowing it. The Special Forces and intelligence community overlapped frequently. I still had no idea what exactly the Iron Lady did back in the old world military, but from what I'd seen of her, it was definitely something that would have involved black operations. There's an alternative. Ruslana broke the impasse, physically stepping between the two old soldiers. A settlement north of Vegas. They set up shop at Indian Springs after the military abandoned it. Traders tell us they're well stocked. Army and Air Force both left a significant stockpile behind. Problem is, they're hostile to everyone but their own people. Then we'll have to impress upon them the threat we all face, and that it's in their best interest to cooperate. It worked once. Eben looked directly at Johnson. How in the hell did she know about that? As always, the Iron Lady was well informed. Her eyes and ears everywhere. When I say they're hostile to everyone but their own, I mean they shoot anyone who gets too close. We've sent envoys. Only one made it back alive. She spat out the latter with fierce anger. Then we take what they have by force. A joint operation, something to cement our newfound alliance, and give us a chance to gain experience operating together. I expected Ruslana to immediately reject the idea. She didn't. Next to me, Alexis immediately stood, her balled-up fists shaking in indignation. Absolutely not. That's not who we are. The Iron Lady let a small smile break her typically inscrutable mask. So idealistic. If only the world was powered by rainbows and puppy dogs. She looked down at Lucky seated on my other side. Lucky's ears flattened and he bared his teeth. Ruslana sighed, a deep, soul-weary sigh. The type of sigh provoked by having the weight of 1,000 souls upon your shoulders. Alexis, you were right about Johnson and his people. I never told you that and I should have listened to you. But this is different. These people won't negotiate. They're not interested in it. Then we should leave them alone, like they want. Find another way. The Iron Lady took a step toward Alexis. Unlike the loudmouth representative earlier, she didn't flinch. There's no other way. You've heard the stories firsthand. The man you love lived with them personally. It's time to ask yourself, what would you do to keep those same horrors from visiting everyone else you love? She shook her head. Not murder and plunder for what we want, what we think we need. Alexis turned to Ruslana. Then we're no better than them. Or her. The last thing she said, nodding dismissively at the Iron Lady. Ruslana looked away. It was clear her mind was already made up. Alexis looked at me in desperation, her eyes begging me to speak up. The Iron Lady was right. Her stone-cold calculations were always right. But so was Alexis. We couldn't build a new society on the bones of everyone who stood in our way, not if we expected it to last. We couldn't keep compromising, pretending it was all for the greater good. But the Iron Lady's forces wouldn't last without resupply, and if they broke before we were prepared, we wouldn't last either. I was tired, exhausted, and somewhere deep inside my brain I could feel the familiar angry burn of the fuego. She's right. Alexis is right. We can't keep pretending it's always about the greater good. We've trampled plenty of lesser goods into the mud already. We have to find another way. Ruslana shook her head. I'm sorry, there is no other way. Not this time. Time is too short. Alexis's face hardened. I could tell she wanted to cry, not in pain or weakness, but sheer frustration. She didn't let a single tear betray her, though. The Iron Lady seemed pleased. You aren't concerned with political pushback on this one? Rusalana shook her head again. No, this is far outside the borders of the Republic. And besides, Republic forces aren't taking it. You are, with all our intelligence, ammunition, and whatever other supplies you need. For the first time since I'd known her, Eben looked stunned. She quickly recomposed herself, though. Both leaders eyed each other closely. Both knew there was no give-in either. The Iron Lady didn't even bother trying to budge her. Fine, you get to keep your hands clean in front of your little Republic. We'll do the heavy lifting. But you give us every scrap of intelligence you have and every bullet we need. Food and water, too. Rusalana nodded in agreement. And one more thing. I want him for this campaign. The Iron Lady's finger pointed squarely at my chest. I was incredulous. Wait, what? You come with me or no deal? I consolidate my forces around Havasu. Good defensible ground there. Leave a wide open corridor straight into California. As usual, the Iron Lady had me by the balls. Days 817 to 820. Why the hell are you dragging me into this? I was furious. It had taken a day to get a chance to talk to Eben alone. How about you unball your fists so we can talk like adults? I hadn't even noticed my balled up fists. I was furious. The fuego screamed for violence in my brain. What do you want from me? The Iron Lady took her time answering. She had guest quarters near the main gates to Farmbridge, the most well-protected part of the town. That wasn't an accident. There's going to be some very difficult times ahead for all of us. I need someone from the Republic. Her disdain was clear as she spat out the name. With a level head, I need someone reliable to see the price being paid in blood. Someone to remind everyone back here the real cost of their tiny little lives. I'm doing this for the people I care about. I don't want this anymore, any of it. So said every brave soul forced to do hard things in tough times. Eben patted my shoulder matronly before sitting back down at her desk to go over the missives. Messengers from her territory arrived daily, bringing news on domestic issues and, more importantly, the war. I ran into Robert down there. There was nothing I could do for him. The Iron Lady stopped her reading and nodded grimly. How bad is it? She was quiet again for a moment before responding. Bad. If we don't get resupply for our heavy vehicles, it's over. For all of us. Days 821 to 823. We had a bit of time before I'd had to leave. Or rather, before we left. Alexis had told the group Lilith, Annie, and Wilson had refused to stay behind. I fought back, but they'd all dug in their heels. They were done splitting up, they said. I was secretly relieved. Days 824 to 827. Watson had been unusually quiet lately. Unusual even for a man of such legendarily few words. Then, one evening he simply approached our group as we sat lazily by the fire, enjoying a rare break in the clouds to see the stars above. Clara and I are getting married. You should all come. For a moment, no one spoke. Then suddenly Lilith jumped up shouting for joy, grabbing Watson's hands and jumping up and down next to him. Watson looked like he wouldn't mind a raider bullet in his skull right about then, as Lilith threw her arms around him in a fierce hug, never once stopping her excited jumping. Lucky picked up on the infectious and spontaneous joy and began to bark, jumping circles around both. Finally, Watson broke free, only to be greeted by a much more reserved hug from Alexis, along with a kiss on the cheek. Congratulations, Watson. I'm really happy for you two. Watson blushed and blustered as Lilith practically dragged him down to take a seat around the fire, excitedly going over every detail of the ceremony to come. I felt sorry for the poor mountain man. He wanted nothing more than a small, quiet affair with Lilith, and was having absolutely none of that. His eyes pleaded for rescue, but this time, he was on his own. Days 828 to 834. Marriage. I think we all forgot that there was more to life than fighting and scratching to survive for one more day. There was romance, love, and wedding ceremonies. None of us had the first clue about properly marrying people. There were some priests amongst the survivors, but none had ever actually done the ceremony. That didn't stop Lilith, who excitedly took it upon herself to be the wedding planner, coordinator, and officiant all at once. Her excited ambitions were only halted by Annie popping her own question, and then suddenly there were two weddings to plan for, and as a bride, Lilith would be officiating for neither. The whole community came together for the double wedding event. One half of the center of attention, Watson once more looked like he was about ready for a raider bullet, but he couldn't hide the joy it brought him to see Clara thoroughly enjoying the entire affair. The other couple, Lilith and Annie, were almost a perfect mirror. Nothing terrified Annie more than being the center of attention of the entire settlement, while Lilith positively drunk in enough attention for both wedding parties. There were no rings, nobody had bothered to scavenge jewelry, which was now worthless. There was also no bridal dresses, much for the same reason, and no doubt much to great relief of Annie. But there was music and dancing, albeit reluctantly from both Annie and Watson, and a great feast. This was more, far more than just a wedding celebration. It was a celebration of life, a reclaiming of what we'd lost. Alana was now technically Watson's stepdaughter, and I could see genuine love and care in Watson's eyes every time he looked at her. Once more, I thought about the daughter he must have had at some point in time, and lost, either before or after the bombs. It was clear from the way he treated Alana that he'd been a father, but I never pried. Neither did anyone else. I shook those sad thoughts away though and enjoyed myself. Alexis by my side and Lucky happily zipping through the crowd, collecting treats and pets from everyone attending until by the end of the night, he was so fat he could barely waddle. It was a good time, a genuinely happy time, but as I caught sight of the Iron Lady watching us from the shadows, I couldn't help but think that this was the calm before a terrible, terrible storm. Days 835 to 840. It was time to move out. A detachment of the Iron Lady's forces would meet us north of Vegas. The city had been absolutely glassed. U.S. nuclear defenses had focused on the west and the east coasts, and Las Vegas took multiple direct hits. The fact that it was home to Nellis Air Force Base had ensured its total annihilation. Some Republic soldiers would escort us in trucks all the way to the edge of our territory. Then we were on our own. The Iron Lady strikers would provide security for the supply trucks from Farmbridge, destined for her assault forces in Havasu. So we'd be on foot once we reached the edge of the Republic. Once supplied, her forces would march off north where we'd link up with them just past Vegas. I watched Watson, Lilith, Annie, and Alexis load up into a truck. Lucky was at my feet, looking pleadingly up at me. "Sorry, buddy, not this time. I'll be back, I hesitated. "I'll be back." I turned to Robbie and Meg, giving them both a final farewell hug. "If we don't come back, you both take Lucky and go north, understand?" Robbie nodded grimly. I turned toward the waiting trucks, rifle on my shoulder and backpack full of supplies. "Hey, wait!" Robbie came running up. "I wanted to thank you for trusting me. After, you gave me a chance. You didn't have to. You basically saved me and Meg's lives." I nodded and clasped him on the shoulder. The trucks roared to life. I didn't want to go. I especially didn't want everyone coming with me. Days 841 to 845. The going was slow even with the trucks. The highways were still largely littered with broken, burned-out husks of vehicles. SoCal was notorious for fires, and with no one to put them out, they'd raged through the freeways and surrounding countryside. Only the desert was spared. The settlements had managed to carve out some clear lanes to make trade easier, but there was no settlement in the direction we were traveling in. Once we entered the Iron Lady's territory, we were on foot. At least we didn't have to worry about raiders. Nobody was stupid enough to defy the Iron Lady's strict laws, and her authority hadn't waned an inch in her absence. The entire thing still left a bad taste in my mouth. We were going to war with a people we had no conflict with, other than they happened to have something we desperately needed, and they didn't want to give up. Days 846 to 850. Highway 15 led straight to Vegas, and we decided to follow it so as to not get lost in the desert. This stretch of highway was technically outside of the Iron Lady's borders, but her patrols routinely swept the area, looking for rivals to put down and travelers to capture. After the first year, nobody came this way anymore. No point. Vegas was glassed. The Hoover Dam partially collapsed, and plumes of fallout had killed everyone in the small communities between Los Angeles and Vegas. Every dozen miles or so, we'd pass another small town full of corpses, their bones picked clean by scavengers, and any useful belongings long ago stripped away by survivors. Days 851 to 856. We just climbed the San Bernardino Mountains, and I was glad to put them behind us. Even on the highway, the going was tough, and the weather dropped to freezing near the top. I remember making the drive from LA to Vegas many times, and it never took more than 3.5, maybe 4 hours. It'd taken us a day and a half to get over the mountains. I was stoking a small fire when I noticed the Iron Lady approaching. She nodded over at a stump next to me. "Mind if I join you?" We hadn't had any time alone since we left. I didn't really want any either, but I shrugged my shoulders. Alexis, Annie, and Lilith were cleaning off best they could in the small spring nearby. A Geiger counter let them know the water was acceptably safe. Nobody went anywhere without a counter anymore. We were silent for a long while. Eben helped feed the flames to grow the fire. "How's your back?" I actually hadn't noticed it until she reminded me of the lashing she'd ordered as punishment for my disobeying her direct order in the midst of combat. I'd saved her and a lot of other people's lives, but I disobeyed nonetheless. When you're holding onto the leash of an empire built on the backs of slavers, cannibals, and raiders, you can't blink for even a second, and you can't have your authority questioned. "It's fine, I guess. Doesn't bother me anymore." Silence again. Finally, she spoke. "I hope in our time together you've come to at least appreciate what I've created." I nodded. I can't imagine what it must take to stay on top of everything you built. And that's the point I'd like to stress to you. Before I came along, there was mass lawlessness. 100 different gangs, groups, survivalists all scratching and clawing at each other, feeding off each other's carcasses for what? One more day of miserable existence. Ebony removed the cap she usually wore. Suddenly, in the firelight, she looked tired for the first time since I'd known her. I gave them a purpose. It wasn't easy, and it sure as hell wasn't pretty. A lot of people died, but a lot of people would have died anyways without order. The difference? I built a civilization from the pools of blood I spilled. No more just surviving, building, advancing, growing. She paused, looking into the flames. I wonder sometimes, did I save more than I killed? You said it yourself, Evan. People would have died either way. She nodded thoughtfully. I knew you'd see it my way. Remember that. Remember what it took to get on top of all these different groups. And remember what will happen if there's no one to hold on to those reins. I cocked my head in surprise. Is something? No, but what's coming? Nobody's going to be the same after it. And some of us might not make it. In the distance, Lilith and Alexis's voice sounded their imminent arrival. Eben stood up, putting the cap back on her head and the stoic mask back on her face. She was no longer tired, sitting by a fire and seeking, what, comfort, validation? She was the Iron Lady once more. You're smart enough to know why I asked you to come along. And with that, she left. Wait, was she seriously insinuating that she wanted me to take over if something happened to her? And what if I didn't? What if there was no one left to hold onto the reins of 100 different gangs of raiders, cannibals, and psychopaths? Days 857 to 862. The weather improved as we made our way down the mountain. It was almost a shame to leave them. We'd occasionally gotten breaks in the clouds to see the stars again after years of dust and smog. But up in the mountains, the breaks were more frequent. I'd nearly forgotten what a starry sky looked like. I imagine that we could have a lot of nights like that in our little cul-de-sac in Big Bear. And then, as always, I remember the ticking time bomb in my brain. Days 863 to 868. I'd been keeping a tight leash on that smoldering fire deep in my subconscious for 2 months now, allowing myself to snap and lose all control in small, discreet bursts far from prying eyes. But the truth was, I was looking forward to what was coming, even as I feared what might happen to the people I loved traveling with me. I was looking forward to the violence I did not want to commit. Days 869 to 872. The attack came at night. One of our sentries took an arrow to the throat, but the shot wasn't completely accurate. He managed to let off a low, gurgling yell before going down, enough to alert the rest of us. The Fuego was in control once more, responding to violence by instinct. I was both unrestrained rage and cold, calculating death. I slipped out of Alexis's and I shared tent with ease, plunging into the darkened woods and far from the firelight. I found them there, at least half a dozen raiders on my side of the camp. They weren't looking into the shadows around them. They were too busy firing at figures backlit by 3 campfires. I didn't use my rifle. It would have been too loud. Besides, I wanted something more satisfying. I needed to do this close and very personal. The first died from a stab to the base of the neck, instantly severing the nerves connecting the brain to the spinal column and the rest of the body. The only thing living about him was his brain as his dead body hit the floor. With the lungs no longer breathing, the brain would black out in 7 or 8 seconds from lack of oxygen. Until then, all he could do was stare with unblinking eyes as I moved to his friend. My knife found 2 more throats. Other times it slid between ribs, piercing through the side to stab across the lungs and into the heart itself. The Fuego was raging, but I wasn't a mindless animal like I'd been after a full dose in the arena. I was methodical, my brain switching off everything that didn't matter and only bothering with what did. Anatomy lessons, silent takedown techniques. It was only a few minutes after the firing had stopped that I'd snapped out of my trance-like state, stalking the shadows for attackers that were no longer there. I hadn't even noticed the bloody slash across my side raking my ribs. Even now the pain didn't come, just an awareness that my body was damaged and that it needed to be repaired. The Aztecos had crafted the perfect combat supplement, even if it inevitably burned your brain up from within. Days 873 to 875. We moved well off the highway to take stock and recoup after a nighttime attack. A search of the bodies revealed no obvious sign of affiliation with any group. Random raiders, obviously taking advantage of the relaxed patrols since the Iron Lady had gone to full-scale war against the Aztecos. Alexis tended to my wound. Now that the Fuego was asleep in my brain again, it hurt like hell. I must not have been quick or quiet enough. Someone had a chance to lash out with their own blade, raking it across my ribs in a downward stroke. But my ribs weren't broken, and they had done their job, deflecting the blade from cutting deeper into my torso. Something's different. Annie told me about the arena. Alexis was changing my bandage, making me wince a bit as it pulled from my bruised and lacerated flesh. I merely grunted in response. I hadn't told her any details, especially not about the fuego or vaquero, but it would have been impossible to hide what I'd been through. New scars crisscrossed my body from dozens of fights. I can't tell you how grateful I am to have you back, to have you by my side again, but sometimes I feel like you're still back there. I grunted in agreement. She didn't know the half of it, but I didn't know what to say. She finished bandaging me up, then grabbing my face in her hand, she smiled and gave me a long kiss. It's okay. I love you and I'm here, always. Days 875 to 879. We were off the highway, now that it was obvious it wasn't as safe as we'd believed. Rather than going through the heart of Barstow, we went around it, moving along the outskirts. There was probably some good salvage left in a town this size, and any original inhabitants had been killed by the massive fallout plumes coming from Vegas. There was no telling if anyone new had taken up residence, since the Iron Lady's patrols had waned in the area. It was better not to risk it, but I was becoming increasingly nervous about how long our trip was taking and what the troops would do if we were significantly late. Eben merely shrugged off my concerns, promising that everything had been accounted for already. I didn't doubt that the Iron Lady had planned for any contingency, and that's what scared me. Days 880 to 885. We headed north to Pahrump. We'd have to go around Mount Charleston, but this was as close as you could get to Vegas and remain safe. Even 2.5 years after being obliterated, Las Vegas was still too radioactive to approach. Whoever hit it, the Chinese, the Russians, had wanted it dead, really badly. When we got to Pahrump itself, several riders on horseback made their way toward us. I could feel the violence rising inside of me, but the Iron Lady merely held up a hand as people reached for their rifles. A few minutes later, I saw why. They wore the emblem of the Army of the Dawn on their lapels. These were her people, scouts who would take us around Mount Charleston via a secret route, cutting our travel time in half and putting us right outside Indian Springs. Days 886 to 889. A mountain is still a mountain, and even more treacherous to cross when you have to take shelter regularly from freak rainstorms. This close to Vegas, the rain was highly radioactive, and we were forced to shelter in our tents for hours at a time until the freak downpours passed by us. The mountain was causing low clouds to accumulate, resulting in the routine downpours. I couldn't help but wonder just how many years we were shaving off our lives via exposure, and if we wouldn't have been better off going around the damn mountain in the first place. But Eben had her reasons as usual. Bandit and raider activity north of Pahrump was on the rise. Nobody controlled the wastes of northern Nevada, but there was a rumor that something or someone was controlling all these raider groups down south, putting enough pressure on them to force them to dislocate and seek victims elsewhere. Days 890 to 891. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. We finally made our way out of the mountain and once more to the flat desert. Indian Springs lay just before us, just a few miles in the distance, but there was no army waiting for us, just plumes of smoke in the direction of our travel. Eben seemed unfazed, deflecting my questions and merely telling me to hurry up and keep moving. Everything's under control, she said. Alexis could barely conceal her hatred of her. Annie remained impassive as usual, but I noticed that her hands were never far from either her rifle or her pistol. Lilith made no attempt to hide her disgust of the Iron Lady and everything she stood for, but traveling in a group of her closest confidants and guards, she was wise enough not to voice it too often. Now, though, all four of us couldn't shake the growing pit in our stomachs. Something was definitely wrong. Days 892 to 895. Bodies had been gathered, stripped of useful equipment, and either thrown into a mass grave or prepared for funeral pyres. The Iron Lady's warriors got the honorary pyres. The settlers who had once called Indian Springs home were all thrown into one large pit. Nobody had bothered to try to cover it up. They merely wanted the dead out of the way. The fighting had been brutal, that was immediately obvious, but the Iron Lady's forces had made good use of our intelligence. They managed to kill most of the settlers' leadership by sending a group pretending to seek terms, only to have each member pull the pin on homemade explosive vests. I was shocked to hear this, but a growing fanatical movement had taken root within the ranks of the Army of the Dawn in response to the desperate fighting against the Aztecos, a cult dedicated to the worship of the Iron Lady herself. For her part, she merely shrugged her shoulders and mentioned that every tool in a toolbox was useful. Part of me abhorred her casual disregard for these poor fanatics. Another part, a much darker part, admired her willingness to use their suicidal fanaticism in such a brilliant, cold-blooded way. Thrown into disarray by the death of most of their leadership, the army attacked, but the settlers were well armed, using mortars and heavy machine guns to repel the attack. The fighting had been brutal and costly, but the Army of the Dawn had secured an absolute bonanza in military equipment. Enough to make their loss in manpower worth it, commented the Iron Lady. Her generals agreed with her, and that's the way she saw the world. Even her own people, a loss-gain calculation that must remain in the net positive, or at the very least in equilibrium. What I didn't understand is why the hell she'd brought me here if she had already commanded her forces to attack without us. Days 896 to 897. I wanted you to see the cost of victory. I wanted you to get a tangible feel for what it takes to win wars and save the people you love. We were in one of the large hangars that had once housed U.S. Air Force drones and planes. Now it was the central collection point for the booty the Army of the Dawn had accumulated from their victory, both material and human. The settlers here had fought like fanatics themselves. Most had died with a gun in their hands, but some were too old or sick to fight. A few men, women, and children hadn't fought at all. The healthy ones who'd make good slaves had been gathered here. The rest, the Iron Lady had given permission to be used for food or entertainment. Alexis and Lilith had left, moving away from the carnage of the battle and the aftermath. Despite everything we'd been through, I'd never once seen hatred in Alexis's eyes until now. She couldn't be around this, not without putting a bullet in the Iron Lady's head. Annie shook her head, stoic as usual, but allowing herself a brief moment of emotion. This wasn't right. This isn't how we do things. Oh, it isn't, is it? The Iron Lady fired back. My soldiers pulled the trigger, but it was your bullets and their guns. Don't you forget that. I'll never forgive Ruslana for this, for any of this. Annie spat on the ground, taking in all the loot and the captives roped together along the hangar's walls. They sat on the ground looking dirty and neglected. Most of them would be sold as slaves. Some eaten, others worse. Annie spun on her heel, storming out of the hangar. Your people all suffer from the delusion that you can rebuild civilization with wishful thinking and good intentions. I'm glad you're not so naive. I mulled over my response. You're not wrong, but you're not always right. All this, what you did here, someone somewhere is going to hear about it. Maybe someone got away. Maybe a traitor tells the story selling off some of your slaves. However it happens, people will hear about it, about what you did here, and they'll hate you for it, just like they hate you for everything else you've done. And they'll teach others to hate you for it. Somewhere, sometime, that'll come back to you, to everything you've built. That's why it's important to be strong. You don't think I want a better world than this? Come on, you're not that stupid. You and I both know, both understand, that if you want to build a better world, the first thing you have to do is bring it to heel. She wasn't right, but she wasn't wrong either. Days 898 to 899. Alexis cried in my arms, all the grief, pain, frustration, outrage from the last 2.5 years, coming out at one single moment of weakness. I held her as she sobbed through all of it. Through the end of the world, the people we lost, the things we or the people we loved had done, trying to build something better from the ashes. Our compromises in the attempt at a compromise. Alexis cried and I held her close, my face buried in her hair, so no one could see that I was crying too. Day 900. The Army of the Dawn had brought a convoy of vehicles with them and commandeered more from their spoils. Now, a caravan loaded with enough firepower to outfit a small army, made ready to head south back toward the Iron Lady's territory. The 4 of us were headed southwest back toward Farmbridge in a truck the Iron Lady had given to us. Once our expeditionary force was ready, we would head east toward Havasu to reinforce the Army of the Dawn. Victory would mean more than playing defense, though. We'd likely have to push southeast into Phoenix, the seat of power for the Aztecos north of the border. War was coming to the former southwestern United States. The sound of 24 engines rumbling to life made it difficult to hear the approaching aircraft until they were nearly on top of us. Suddenly, though, everyone seemed to hear it at once, and we all craned our heads up toward the sky, searching through the clouds. A moment later, there it was. A gray-blue shape breached through the bottom of the clouds, revealing the broad wings of a C-27 with the logo of the United States Air Force on both sides of the fuselage. It rumbled directly over us, dispersing small canisters which floated down on parachutes and burst open in midair. For a moment, I thought about diving for cover, but then I realized the canisters weren't bombs. They were dropping leaflets, hundreds of them. I snatched one as it fell, staring at it incredulously. I turned it over in my hand, but both sides said the same thing in big, bold letters. You are not forgotten. You are not abandoned. America remains. Radio address from the President of the United States of America in 2 days. Tune in to the AM frequencies listed below. Now go watch how it all started with I Survived 100 Days of Nuclear War, or click this other video instead.